All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program, Creative Thinking in the Digital Space, Navigating Social Media in Tumultuous Times. My name is Meredith LaChapelle, and I work in the Office of Alumni Engagement here at Bates, and we're so happy to have you here with us tonight. This program is part of the Bates Alumni Experts series, which we first launched virtually this fall. We look forward to having many more programs just like these. And we hope they'll offer some insider tips and information from some of our very own alumni who have expertise in varying industries and interests. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my colleagues in the Alumni Engagement Office and also our communications team for helping to execute and promote this program. Thank you very much. Although it may be difficult to see in a virtual setting like this, many of you already know that the Bates networking connections are strong. If you're currently looking for inspiration, are interested in learning some helpful tips and tricks, or are simply here just to reconnect with Bates, these virtual programs are a great reminder of the power of the Bates network, no matter where you are. We hope that you connect with our panelists and with one another beyond this virtual program. And additionally, if you're looking for more opportunities to connect with fellow alumni, Bates Bridge and the Bates Alumni page on LinkedIn are two really great spots to start. I'm happy to share that information with you in the post-event follow-up survey, which you'll receive tomorrow. Before we get to our speakers, I just want to cover some quick logistics and housekeeping, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the program. We're all very familiar with Zoom at this point, and just a reminder to our guests, we'll be recording this program, and we ask that you please remember to keep yourself on mute during the presentation. We will be opening up the conversation at the end for some Q&A. Our moderator, Ellie Vance, class of 21, will share with you when it is time for that. You're welcome to enter the questions into the chat at the end of the program, or let us know in the chat if you would rather ask your question in person. We welcome either option. Ellie will begin the conversation with approximately 30 minutes of discussion time, and then we'll pose some questions submitted by you, our audience, afterwards. And now I'm happy to introduce our alumni expert and our moderator. First, we welcome Doug Ray. Doug Ray is a 2010 Bates alum with degrees in theater and East Asian studies and holds master's degrees in communications and journalism from Stanford University and museum anthropology from Columbia University. He grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and is currently the social media coordinator for the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a specialist in community development and digital communications. In his current role, he manages one of the largest online communities devoted to the study of education and crafts the institutional voice for the leading school in the study of learning. For over a decade, Doug has established himself as an important voice among social media managers. He has previously spent time with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, and several Silicon Valley startups. Outside of the digital space, Doug enjoys road cycling, photography, and finding excuses to visit Scandinavia. Please help us in welcoming Doug. Our discussion moderator this evening is Ellie Vance, a member of the class of 2021. Ellie is a double major in psychology and politics. She is an editorial assistant and writer for the Bates Communication Office. She is also one of the co-presidents of the Bates Jewish Student Union and a radio DJ for WRBC. She is also an avid sourdough bread baker, loves to hike, and is a French press coffee enthusiast. While she's at her home in Alabama, she helps her family care for their 10 chickens. Please join me in welcoming Ellie.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, so much for being here to share your time with us on a weeknight evening. And thank you both to Ellie and Doug for sharing your time and also your expertise. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ellie.
All right. Thank you, Meredith. And it's really nice to be here with you guys, even though it is virtual. And thank you to Doug for sharing your time with us. We really do appreciate having you. I'll go ahead and jump into our first question on social media. So basically, the career field of social media and communications can appear to be one of those avenues that's rather nonlinear and more difficult to get experience in. So how exactly did you land this job, and what do you love most about it?
Working in social media is it's a complicated career path to follow. I sort of right out of Bates, I went to journalism school in large part because it was 2010 and the economy was falling flat, and I had a theater degree and an Asian studies degree and sort of didn't know what I was going to do with the world. And part of it was just convincing my parents that all this stuff that I was doing with the radio station was like leading to something. But I went to, so I went out to journalism school and really got into the social media thing as sort of the early heady days of Twitter and Facebook and all that was happening, and you're sort of in the middle of it. My career path is very strange. It really got launched by a meme that came out about 9 years ago, something like that, of social media explained with donuts. It went like mega viral, and then all of a sudden I became like a social media star for like a long weekend. But that brought me like I had been working at sort of a marketing agency and just sort of doing that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden it was like, all these companies were like interested in like, we need this guy because he seems to know what this is all about. And I don't think anyone that works in social media yet has quite figured out what they're doing, which is one of the things that makes it sort of an interesting realm to work in, that, everyone's still figuring it out. No one's really quite sure where this, the whole social media thing is going. And that's interesting and exciting, but it's also sort of vaguely terrifying. But one of the things that makes it an interesting career path is that you don't necessarily need to know anything to do it. And you kind of need to know how to do everything. So you're kind of this utility player on any comms team where you're doing video work and you're doing, maybe they'll have you putting together a podcast because they're like, oh, podcasts are cool. Social media guy can do that, right? You need to understand the platforms really well. But then you have a lot of people that there's like no other job like it where everyone thinks they know how to do your job. Like no one goes to their brain surgeon. It's like, well, I have a brain, so I know how to, do brain surgery. It's that's one of the weirdest things to navigate about it. It's everyone's like, well, I have a Facebook account and I did this thing once and that seemed to do well. And I got 10 likes. And it's like, there's a difference between doing this work like for fun as an individual and doing it at behest of a brand. But yeah, I mean, applying for jobs in social media in general, like I've applied to jobs that have gotten 1,500 applications for one position. And sometimes you apply to jobs and you're the only one that applied, so a lot of it is, the brand that you're working for and what the marketplace is. But so my career path, like I ended up with the job that I have now. I just applied for it online. Like it just was looking for jobs, and Harvard, is Harvard, and didn't really know much about the School of Education or anything like that. It was just like, yeah, whatever. This seems good. Like I'd like to live in Boston for a few years. So there isn't that sort of like well-worn career path yet in social media of sort of like, like in traditional journalism, you go and you work at, a local paper, and then you move to a, sort of a metro paper, and then you move to the New York Times or something like that. That just doesn't exist in social media. It's like you got people who are straight out of undergrad or didn't even go to college doing really great things in the space. And then you've got, people who, are career communicators who have been around the block for decades and are just sort of like discovering that, it doesn't take a lot to, sort of be successful on these platforms. So in that sense, it's like, if this is work that you want to do, it's just dive in and hope for the best. It's sort of the best advice that I can put is, because a lot of times you're just trying to, get lightning in a bottle when you're applying for social media gigs. And a lot of it is, you really need to connect with the people that are ultimately hiring you, because particularly if you're doing this on a professional basis at behest of a brand, you have this weird thing that happens when you enter the role where you go from like having nothing to do with this organization to being its voice, which is an interesting shift, and one that, you just sort of have to dive in and make mistakes early on and sort of figure out what your audience wants and doesn't want.
Yeah, great. How do you think that the role of a social media coordinator has changed with the most recent wave of more interactive social media platforms such as Instagram and even TikTok that exist now?
So, Instagram's been around for a bit. It's where Facebook is throwing a lot of its innovation right now. Like, they're not putting a ton of innovation on the sort of the central platform. But I like Instagram a lot. I think it's a place that you can be kind of like cozy on social media in a way that you can't really on like Twitter or Facebook or particularly LinkedIn. Like, they're sort of like it's great for community building. And so we use it a lot. We use it a lot, like sort of to drive, student engagement and those sorts of things. Like, student young alumni are really active on those platforms, and we want to be there. I personally I've experimented with TikTok personally. It's like the first platform that I've finally reached the point that I'm like, I don't understand this. I'm getting too old for this line of work. One of the things that makes things like TikTok successful, and even Snapchat a few years ago, is that brands don't know how to operate in that space. So like, I don't know how, as the Harvard Graduate School of Education, to operate in TikTok, which is going to make TikTok more successful to a point. What hurt Snapchat was that at a point, Snapchat needed money. And so they needed to figure out how to get brands to give them that money. And by that point, sort of Facebook had, through Instagram, gobbled up most of their market share as far as like, brand operations are. So like things like TikTok, I find them to be interesting. I think for better or worse, brands really aren't welcome there. So that's why I don't really sort of play around in that sandbox. But, one of the trickiest things about doing social media, like sort of at a professional basis, is building audience. And so, we have audiences on LinkedIn and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So, that's sort of like where we're staying right now. That's part of the reason why you have sort of these flash in the pan social media spaces that sort of pop up and become sort of buzzy, and they all seem to eventually go away just because at a certain point they run out of money, and they haven't built a space for brands to really effectively advertise on them. I mean, the secret sauce of particularly Facebook has been it's super easy to advertise on that platform, and so that's why they're just sort of sticking around. And further integration with Instagram is just making it easier to advertise on Instagram. So, but ultimately, like, early success of these platforms is dictated by the fact that like brands are confused and stay away, and that's sort of what's going on with particularly TikTok right now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. So this summer, we saw what was perhaps a record-breaking number of companies who engaged in social and political dialogue during both the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the nationwide police brutality protests that were occurring. So how do you interact with such political discourse while you're also managing the School of Education's social media presence?
Yeah, so for us, it wasn't that big of a shift because we're always sort of talking about sort of what's going on in the world through the lens of education, obviously. But, for a lot of brands, like we have this advantage, like in higher education in particular, like we don't we're not really like a consumer product. So like in the consumer product space, like having to pivot from, spending all of your time and energy trying to get people to buy something. So when I was in the museum world, for example, like we had to think a lot about like new and creative ways to convince people to actually like come and give us their money and walk around the museum for an afternoon. In higher ed, we don't have to think that way, which is sort of nice and refreshing. We have a few sort of in the marketing lingo, sort of like conversion points, mostly admissions and development related. But most of the time, like our business is, we have our sort of on-campus business, which is, educating future leaders in education and all that sort of stuff. But then we also like our communications office in general is very broadly focused on just getting the information that's being generated through our, faculty and students and everything else, and getting it actually to, practitioners in the field. So getting it to teachers, getting it to superintendents, getting it to principals, getting it to parents, anyone that's sort of like involved in the education of children. We're really like trying to, collect what we can and sort of make it freely available. So from a social media perspective, like our work didn't change, just to some extent, like what we were taught. Like we, a year ago, we weren't thinking about like, how are we going to better, support, parents learning at home? Like that wasn't just wasn't a huge thing at the time. Now it's a lot of what we're doing is we're a lot of thinking about like trying to find little pointers about how to, have your kids doing school while you're working and those sorts of things. And we've launched an entire webinar series based on just like, every week or two, just responding to like what's going on in the world right now. And let's sort of break it down and, make it digestible for people to, actually like do something with it, so to speak. So in that sense, like, our work hasn't changed. When the world gets sort of into the fuzzy realm of controversy, I think there's this like, there's this false equivalency that exists between sort of fairness and truth. Like sort of this idea of like when it comes to climate change, for example, like, well, we need to talk about both sides of this argument. And there aren't both sides. Like climate change is a thing that's happening. If there's a both sides argument, it's should we do something about it or not? Not does it exist or not? And so, the nice thing again about working in higher ed is that, we can sort of, instead of sort of having to play this both sides game, we can just be like, no, like these are real problems that are really happening in the real world and we're going to try and help them. And I think that's help resolve them. And so that's sort of, so as I say, it hasn't been that much of a shift, just, the things that we're talking about are different now, but that's just sort of how the world is in general.
Yeah, great. In a sort of similar vein, how is managing the social media of Harvard's education program different from, say, a clothing company, for example, or really any kind of corporation that doesn't necessarily involve higher education?
Yeah, so, I mean, the big thing is that we are not really selling a product on a day-to-day basis. So like the model is in a sense flipped. Like most people that are, social media managing, they're thinking about, I need to talk about, there's sort of this argument that comes out of like marketing classes in particular. It's kind of like, you need to do 70% content and 30% promotional marketing stuff. I think it's got to be 100% all of the above if you can make it work that way. But the idea being you bring in and you gather an audience based on the fact that you're giving them useful information. And then every so often and, try and directly sell them on something. So you're building audience, you're building engagement, and then subsequently using that goodwill to, convert to a product sale. We're kind of the inverse of that, which is like, we're doing all this goodwill and then hoping that over time someone follows us on Instagram and says, hey, this school's doing, cool and interesting thing. And maybe they think about applying. Right. So, but also the, sort of the conversion process, if you will, it's sort of a bad analogy for university, but you might go on, Amazon and just buy something silly because you're bored, but you're not going to apply to graduate school because you're bored. I mean, you might, but you're going to think about it for at least a few days. So, we're less interested in that sort of is social media driving applications as much as making sure that applications are, doing a certain thing. But I'm not super directly involved in any of sort of the business marketing operations of the institution. So, in a lot of ways, it's a very sort of pure social media job that it's sort of I know I need to talk about admissions deadlines and all those things just because I know that that's something that our audience is interested in. Those posts do well. But, there's not I don't have anyone breathing down my neck being why isn't social media driving, 45 applications last year it did this, or there's that sort of numbers game isn't there, but particularly the major platforms now are so much focused on advertising that the idea of sort of instant viral success that's going to lead to huge conversions it doesn't not exist, but doesn't exist in the same way that it did 5-10 years ago. So, I think a lot of people who get into the social media world are really interested in what's going to be that post that just sort of catapults us to, being internet famous. And, it's much more of a long game now than it's ever been, where you're just you got to make sure that you're posting things on a regular basis and that, you're tracking data and you're seeing incremental improvements, but, sort of the flash in the pan success story, they still exist, but they're much rarer now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction, especially to me as someone who doesn't know that much about the realm of social media work. So how has your role as a coordinator shifted since the beginning of the pandemic, and how do you think the job will sort of change and further shift in the future?
So it's interesting because I'm sort of much more central to the organization now than I was. I mean, I'm not in if I were back in the museum world, there would have been this weird thing that happened where I went from being sort of a sideshow to the museum for a period of time while they were closed. And, thankfully I didn't have to do that, but all of a sudden it's we were really focused on sort of this public communications thing. And now we need to care more about, the students themselves and what's going on sort of on campus. I mean, we're fully virtual for the entire year. So there is this weird shift where, typically I could just go over to campus and take, some pretty pictures of red brick buildings and get, hundreds of likes on that. Can't really do that anymore. We're not really allowed to be on campus at all. So, so that's been a big shift, that it's sort of you switch from being this place and really sort of focusing on the place as a thing. And now we're sort of switching to, being a people. So if you look at our Instagram, for example, you go back a few months, the Instagram feed was lots of, very few pictures of people. Now it's a lot of pictures of people. We're really sort of, so it's forced me to work harder on that angle of it because, people just don't have that same sense of community that they do when they're sort of crammed into a bunch of academic buildings. But I mean, ultimately, my job has my day-to-day mechanical work hasn't changed that much. which is one of the nice things about one of like the pros and cons of working in social media is that you can work from anywhere, which means you work from anywhere. So, you know, you'll work on vacation, you'll work, you know, nights and like whatever, because as long as you have an internet connection, you can do your job, and most of your job you can do on your phone. So, you know, it hasn't been like a huge transition for me other than like having to live in Zoom and those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, it's different for everyone, but you know, it's sort of like, other than having a few more eyeballs on me institutionally, I'm still sort of like, you know, doing what I do.
Yeah. Well, to sort of round the conversation out and bring it back to your time at Bates, what, if any, of your academic and extracurricular pursuits during college put you on the path to working in social media and communications? And then what advice would you give Bates students who are interested in pursuing a job like yours in social media but don't know where to start?
So the big thing when I was at Bates, like I got super involved in the radio station. That was, you know, and so like academically, like you know, I was a theater and Asian studies major. And so there was like, every once in a while, someone will have me like translate something in Japanese, which is just kind of like this funny thing to me because I was like a terrible Japanese student. But they're like, hey, can you translate this? And I'll just like go on to like, you know, like an online dictionary and just be like, all right, this is, I think, what it says. But I really don't use much in that regard. And also like theater, you know, there's a certain degree of like communication skills and stuff that go along with that. But and just problem solving, like a theater major is as much about like trying to solve problems as it is about like, you know, actually like acting or directing or anything like that. It's like, how do we make this work? We have no money. That's being a theater student. But I really got into the social media thing through the radio station. I mean, I was sort of like intrigued by social media, like, you know, sort of like grew up with it in a sense, like sort of like the first wave of people that are like, oh yeah, like this is a thing that we're going to do now. So like, you know, through really, you know, low level social media stuff, like we managed to like, you know, really drive a lot of interest in, you know, musicians that no one in central Maine had ever heard of, and like that sort of thing. And just like, we really sort of, me and my friends, basically, we just sort of took over the radio station, just ran with it. And I was in charge of publicity. And then once I got to Stanford, I thought like I was going to be super remedial with like the computer stuff, because I had gone to like, you know, this little liberal arts college and majored in theater. And I got out there and it was like, oh, you know how to use Facebook. Like we need someone who can do that for our like, you know, news service. So yeah, I mean, the advantage of going to a small college is that like, there's always the ability to just sort of like jump in and, you know, maybe it's the radio station, maybe it's the newspaper, maybe it's the, you know, outing club, whatever. But you can just sort of dive in and just start doing things and experimenting and like making a mess. And like, you're not really going to hurt that much by doing it. So, whereas if you go to like, you know, like Penn State or something like that, you're not going to be able to like that easily just be like, hey, like you need someone to do social media for the student newspaper. Like, yeah, we've got like an entire team working on that, you know. At Bates, you can kind of just do things. And that's one of the nice things about, you know, a school like that is that, you know, there isn't that much stopping you. And there isn't that much like sort of infrastructure that's built up that it's like, you know, well, we already have a social media team for, you know, this thing or that thing. It's like usually there's space to just sort of jump in. But yeah, so I mean, ultimately the role, like social media management isn't that different, whether you have an audience of 1 million or an audience of 10. like the mechanics of it aren't that different. So as long as you can sort of like, sort of prove that you've added sort of value to the thing that you were managing social media for, like that's a good stepping stone. So it's like, if you just decide that you want to do social media for, the track team or something like that, like, yeah. And, if you grow an audience and people are interacting with you, then yeah, you can parlay that into, any number of places just by sort of just understanding the back end of the platforms is probably enough to get you, like, if you wanted to, for example, to go into like politics super interested in social media. Like if you just know how to use Facebook pretty well, like there's a local, a state congressional race somewhere that will hire you and they won't pay you a lot of money. But you can say, hey, I did this in college, and they'll be like, oh, sure. Yeah. We need someone who does social media. And then, that might parlay into a regular congressional campaign, or you might end up in a political staff, something like that. But that's like probably if there's a career path out there in social media, it's probably politics right now. I mean, maybe not right. Well, a week from now, not right now, but, and there's, it's becoming more and more normalized. When I got into it, it was like, oh, you're that weird person that does social media. Like no one took you seriously until they absolutely needed you. And that still kind of exists, but not to the same extent. But yeah, I mean, what it comes down to, it like sort of being 10 years out from Bates, like I use a lot of like the general education classes that I took a lot more than like sort of the classes I took as my major. So like I worked at a science museum and I took, like a couple astronomy courses just because I needed to take science classes. And I ended up like working at the science museum and like just sort of sitting there like casually talking about planets and stuff. And I was like, oh, I actually learned something in college. That's good to know. Like, but yeah, I mean, as I said, like the entire social media career path is entirely predicated by just sort of being able to dive in and do things. So, find somewhere that you can dive in and do things. And, a lot of people in this industry, like they're very effective at like talking a big game. And so, I rode WRBC to the bank because it was like, yeah, we're the number 14 best college radio station in the country. And that was sort of enough then. It might change now, but yeah, I mean, this is a learn by doing industry, and that's, so the best thing you can do is just do it. And, like no one knows what they're doing. So you're not going to like, you might make mistakes, but you're not going to end the world by doing them. So.
Great. As someone who's like thinking about career options now, it's reassuring to hear that you had that experience. I think with a few minutes left, we're going to open up our discussion to questions from the audience. As Meredith said earlier, and you guys either feel free to enter them in the chat function in Zoom to me, and I can read them out loud. Or if you want, you can also raise your hand using the Zoom function, and we will unmute you so you can ask your questions out loud. Hi, yes.
Hi, guys. I'm Lily. I graduated class of 2017. It's nice to see your faces. And this is my partner. We actually had recently started an e-commerce business, and we're kind of diving into social media. So we were really excited to have this opportunity to hear from Doug and his experience. I had also worked in a museum at the Met previously. And so I do have more experience in the non-for-profit world and communications. And so diving into influencer marketing and what tools to use, just coming up with layout and design, I was just curious to learn if you could recommend any kind of tools that you like to use personally for any posts that you create. So
I'm a little old school. Like I just use Photoshop and stuff like that. I mean, one of the true joys of my current position is that I do not have to do just about any influencer marketing. You know, to some extent, like, you know, we do have people, we do have students that are like legitimate influencers, but, you know, we don't sort of need to cultivate them in the same way that, you know, a lot of other brands do. Like, people just want to brag about going to Harvard. So that's kind of nice. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's hundreds of different products out there as far as like, you know, management products and, you know, things that are going to make, you know, image macros and stuff like that. You know, I just, in general, I don't think they're worth the money that they're trying to charge you for them. But that being said, like, it really depends on like how big your audience is. And so if you're trying to, if you have a really small audience, I would focus your money on, you know, like there are Facebook ad products that you can just use just to build audience, for example. Like I would rather spend my money building audience than spend it on, you know, a product that's going to potentially help me, you know, sort of do my work better or more efficiently, particularly if it's like, you know, like right now I have a pretty sizable audience. Previously I had a pretty sizable audience. And so I had to like, but even like, you know, working at the Met, we had, you know, like at the time we had 1 million followers on Twitter, and we weren't paying money for anything. Like we were just like, and that's the advantage of having 400,000 objects at your disposal and be like, yeah, it's like National Waffle Day. Let's post a picture by Van Gogh. Like that's the advantage that you have in that kind of marketplace. But I mean, you know, I haven't worked that much in like sort of direct e-commerce, so I don't know exactly that much about the space. But that being said, you know, in general, I think your money is probably best spent within the platforms themselves rather than spending it elsewhere, because, you know, ultimately Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and whomever else are going to look most favorably on those sort of like, are you giving us money? Like Facebook, right. Like Mark Zuckerberg's like into that. If it's, you know, like, you know, a lot of like, we work with an agency for our marketing stuff. And previously I've worked with a number of agencies, and, you know, they make your life a lot easier. But the flip side is that you're kind of like, to some extent, it's like, it's so easy to do advertising on Facebook. Why? Like, you know, we use an agency for a wide variety of marketing tactics, but so Facebook's just one of them. But if I was just doing social marketing, I would save my money and just do it myself.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're starting from ground zero. We just launched in June, so we went from 0 followers. We currently, we're doing okay. I mean, we have like around 500 followers, but it's certainly not 1 million followers, but we definitely hope to grow. So if you guys want to check us out, we're at Funny Aprons, and we're open to your feedback as well if you just want to check that out. But I think, I mean, we don't have a big budget, so we can't spend a whole lot of money on Facebook ads, given that they're so expensive during COVID as well. So we have been trying to think of other strategies, other ways to market that are more cost friendly to a small business.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, the influencer strategy like might work for you. Like I say, like it's like I've had to play with mommy bloggers before. I mean, I don't know exactly what your product is, but, you know, if you can...
Aprons, yeah. So you can like put your pets or your face on an apron or oven mitts. Yeah.
URL is marketing.
You gotta roll. I mean, I hate influencers. They drive me crazy, but that's, if you're trying to, you know, make a big splash with not a lot of money, like, you know, celebrities, influencers, like, you know, if you can get them product, like that's probably where, you know, there, I don't see a huge value, for example, in like growing your audience as much as like getting your product on people that are just going to, you know, hype your product. And that might translate long term to growing an audience. I mean, there are plenty of like, fashion brands that have come out of nowhere just because they're pumping tons and tons of money into social advertising. If you don't have that money, then yeah, it's an influencer strategy, and it's hard, but it's like start small, find sort of a mid-level chef, maybe a YouTuber, and just like there are a lot of ridiculous YouTubers in food, and just just make them and send them to them and see what happens. But yeah, influencer strategy is probably the way I would go. Otherwise, just like take whatever money you can find and pump it into audience development would be probably where I would be. But
okay, thank you.
So when you say developing audiences, right? You mentioned building an audience. So what methods would you recommend doing that? Because obviously you need to spend money on marketing to build an audience, right? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Do you have suggestions?
There's like, particularly on Facebook, like and Twitter actually, there's a specific ad product that's just for essentially adding followers. It's a tricky product to use. I mean, I don't really want to, I could spend 4 hours getting into the specifics of it, but basically like, if you want it, like there's a certain value on social media to just having a large audience. Like people aren't invested super in like looking in and seeing like, hey, like they've got, 20,000 followers on Facebook. They might stop at that. And it's like, depending on where you want to build audience, like you can build a fairly sizable audience for not a lot of money. You'll get a lot of people in like India and the Philippines, but they will be like legitimate followers, and they'll just make you look sort of like more legit in a sense. And yeah, like it was just like you'll have a larger audience and people will say, oh, this is a real company type thing. It's a strategy if you're trying to be like a big brand. It's not a great strategy if you're like, a pizza restaurant. Because you're just trying to like get people from your community to come and order pizza. But if you're trying to build out a brand and sort of like, look big time, it's a way to make a splash with not a lot of money early on, just so people say, oh, this is a real company type thing. So yeah, I mean, like I said, it's just a Facebook ad product. It's like ad followers or something like that. But you have to, depending on how much you want, an audience that's very, specific. Like you can go from like fractions of a cent per follower to, $5-10 of followers. Like when I was working in Philadelphia at the museum, like, if we just wanted like English language speaking followers, we were paying a cent per follower. If we wanted, people living in Philadelphia with kids who, enjoy like doing fun things on the weekend and are interested in science, that was probably $3 a follower.
Okay, interesting.
Cool. Thank you guys for the question. And we do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So if you do need to run now that it's past 7:45, we're more than happy to connect you guys afterwards. But also, if you want to stay on for a few minutes longer, we're happy to open it up to anyone else's questions.
Yeah, I think Nancy is
Nancy, yes, go.
So you can hear me now? That is awesome. Okay, I want to hone in on the creative part. I'm brand new to social media. I've only been on it for about a year, but my tact has been, I think, a little bit unconventional. I'm on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Nextdoor, so local community, broader based. And then I've doing something called digital literature, which has both an educational component, entertainment component, and a social activism component. And I just want to know if anyone out there has seen anything like what I'm trying to do. for instance, I can write a hyperlink document, a story, put it on Nextdoor. It's a mystery. So if they're crime scene photos, I can put the crime scene photos in lost and found section. There's an event associated with it, so I can post an event. There's press releases, so I can do that as well. And then they all, even your profile page can be interwound in this creative experience. And I'm just trying to find if anyone else does anything like that, because I've been looking, but I haven't found anything. No.
I mean, there's surely something like that out there. I mean, I haven't come across anything quite like that, but I mean, there's certainly like, choose your own adventure kind of digital media products that exist. Like Netflix has done a few, sort of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I mean, if it's working and it's getting people engaged, like keep on keeping on.
I'm trying. I think people are very interested, but it's so new. That's one of the aspects of it, is it's introducing a whole new process of reading to somebody. And so because it's multi-layered, different documents interconnected, what I start off with is sort of what a primer, sort of teach people, okay, this is how you actually experience something. It's almost like directions. Because I don't think, at least again, I've never run into this, except for in a really tiny format. Well, like in an article, you read a news article, there are going to be hyperlinks to external sources, and it could be video, it could be a whole bunch of different other things. But to use it in terms of literature, and as well as a way to educate people, especially about political activism, just hoping somebody had heard something about that.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
I mean, do you think? Go ahead.
Well, no, it's just one of the things I think, and this all evolved out of just simply wanting to put a list of humorous things on Nextdoor when the lockdown started. And it just evolved. And I think one of the best uses of it is actually educational component. And that's one of the reasons why I'm curious, because obviously you're involved with an educational institution. And I just don't know who to talk to, who to try to engage with on this.
Who to talk to? I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is, it depends on who your audience is for it. So that's always like where I would center any like sort of social digital communications experience, is like, think about your audience and who they are following, who they're interested in. What brands do they like? So center it there. I mean, ultimately, the real question I would have is like, is this something that you're doing because you like doing it, or is it something that you hope to monetize? Because the monetization question is sort of ultimately, like, when it comes to, like, if you just like doing stuff on social media, just do it. Like, no one's going to stop you pretty much. So if it's fun and you're having a good time and people are, sort of getting joy out of it, yeah, just keep doing it. If you're trying to make money off of it, that's a very different question. A lot of people sort of jump into, for example, like the influencer thing, thinking like, oh, like I'm going to become an influencer and like I'm going to get free vacations and it's going to be great. And if that's not what you're interested in, if it's just like a thing that you're doing on the side just because, you're hoping to spark joy in people's lives, yeah, just do it and hope for the best. And generally that's like the best strategy on social digital media in general, is just do things and have fun with it. If you start making money, great. If you don't, like, at least you're having a good time.
Oh yeah, definitely a labor of love. That's for certain.
So, but yeah, if you're looking to monetize it, then it's like, probably thinking about like connecting with publishers and, things like that, and sort of trying to, create experiences that exist behind a paywall and all that sort of stuff. But again, like my best advice is like do fun things and hope people notice.
Okay, thank you.
Can I go, or is that okay?
I think, unfortunately,
that's fine.
I'm so sorry. We went over a little bit, but again, we are more than happy to connect people afterwards if you're interested. Really, really enjoyed getting to hear everyone's comments. And I think I'm now going to turn it back over to Meredith for some closing remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Ellie. So I just want to say, most importantly, thanks to all of you for attending this evening's program. It was really insightful. I know I learned a lot, certainly have more to learn as we go. And as Ellie has mentioned a couple of times now, we're certainly happy to connect any of you offline for future conversations, as I think there will definitely be some opportunity for that in the future. Huge thanks to Doug and Ellie. Both of you made this a really fun evening. And thanks to you both so much for your willingness to spend the time with us and to participate in such an interesting topic. And I certainly am really excited to see what comes next in the social media space as we continue through the end of 2020 and beyond. For those of you who have attended the program tonight, if you're interested in hearing from any of our future alumni experts or know of anyone who might be interested in sharing their expertise with us like Doug has, I'm happy to share that information with you in the post-event follow-up survey, which will be circulated to you all tomorrow for your thoughts and feedback and any sort of future questions. And I just hope that you all enjoyed Doug's insight and tips as much as I did and are able to apply it in some of your personal and professional experiences moving forward. And again, thanks so much for making the time for us on a weeknight with friends from Bates. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon.